The pounding started before the sun came up, metal on metal, sharp enough to pull me out of sleep like an alarm I never set. Flashlights swept across my bedroom window, white beams cutting through the blinds. I stumbled to the door half-dressed, heart hammering, and saw two uniformed HOA compliance officers standing at my gate with clipboards like badges of authority. One of them had already stepped onto my driveway, boots crunching on gravel as if he owned the ground beneath him. A black SUV idled at the curb, hazard lights blinking like a silent threat. "Emergency inspection," the taller one said. "Board orders. Every property on this street falls under our jurisdiction now." I told them to step back. This was private land. They smiled the way people do when they think they have already won. One mentioned fines. Another said liens. Noon deadlines. Legal force. Curtains shifted in neighboring windows. I felt the heat of humiliation rise in my chest, then settle into something colder, steadier. Behind the door, my fingers tightened around a thin folder they did not know existed. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to Fenceline File Stories. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? I did not choose that street by accident. After years of moving from one cramped apartment to another, sharing walls so thin I could hear strangers arguing at midnight, I wanted silence more than anything. The cul-de-sac sat at the far edge of town where the pavement narrowed and the trees started to lean inward like they were protecting something. A shallow creek curved behind the last row of houses, and beyond that was nothing but brush and open sky. The first time I stood there, keys in my hand, the air smelled like damp leaves instead of exhaust fumes. It felt like exhaling after holding my breath for years. The house itself carried history. It had belonged to my uncle, a man who believed paperwork was armor and independence was a religion. He labeled every folder, dated every receipt, and kept surveys rolled in thick tubes like blueprints to a fortress. When he passed, he left the property to me along with boxes of documents tied with twine and a handwritten note that said, simply, "Keep your records safe." At the time, I thought it was just his personality talking. I did not realize he was handing me a shield. The neighborhood looked peaceful in that curated, postcard way. Lawns trimmed evenly, porches decorated with small seasonal wreaths, bicycles leaning against fences without chains. The mail carrier waved on the second day like we had known each other for years. Kids rode their scooters in lazy circles around the cul-de-sac, their laughter echoing off the garages. People nodded when they walked their dogs. It was the kind of place you imagine when you tell yourself life is finally going to slow down. The homeowners association existed, of course, but at first it felt distant and harmless, like background noise you barely notice. A thin newsletter appeared in my mailbox once a month with cheerful fonts and reminders about holiday lights or lawn watering schedules. There were invitations to community picnics and gentle notes about keeping sidewalks clear. Nothing aggressive. Nothing that felt personal. I filed the papers away, mostly out of habit, not concern. The first time I met the board leader, she arrived with a bright smile and a wicker basket filled with brochures and laminated cards. She spoke warmly, complimented the color of my door, and welcomed me to the neighborhood with the enthusiasm of someone auditioning for kindness. But her smile lingered a second too long after each sentence, as if she were waiting to see whether I would flinch. I remember thinking she seemed overly polished, like a salesperson who never quite stopped selling. Still, I thanked her, accepted the basket, and told myself I was being overly cautious. Little things began appearing after that. A slip of paper about my mailbox being half an inch lower than the preferred standard. A reminder that my garbage bin had been visible from the street on a Tuesday afternoon. None of it serious, none of it expensive, just small nudges that felt unnecessary but not worth fighting. Neighbors started offering quiet advice in passing. Keep every receipt. Photograph your yard once a month. Save emails. They said it casually, like they were talking about the weather, but their eyes told a different story. I nodded politely and told them I appreciated the tip, then went back to unpacking boxes and hanging curtains. Weeks passed and I noticed her car more often. Parked at the corner with the engine running, idling across the street while someone trimmed hedges. The first time I saw her lift a phone and take a picture of a house, I assumed it was for a newsletter. The third time, I felt a ripple of unease I could not quite name. It was subtle, easy to dismiss. Maybe she was just diligent. Maybe I was projecting old apartment anxieties onto a new life. I wanted peace so badly that I kept giving every odd detail the benefit of the doubt. Then the envelope arrived. Thick, official-looking, my name printed in bold letters across the front. Inside was a formal warning citing a rule I had never read, never signed, never even heard mentioned. The language was polite but firm, the kind that pretends to smile while tightening its grip. I stood in my kitchen holding the paper, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the distant laughter of kids outside, and felt something shift inside me. It was not fear yet. It was the realization that the calm I thought I had found might have been conditional all along, resting on rules I had never agreed to follow. The first official warning letter was irritating, but it was still something I could file away as a misunderstanding. The second one felt deliberate. The third one proved it was a pattern. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, I pulled a larger envelope from the mailbox and knew before I even opened it that the tone had changed. Inside was an invoice. Not a warning. Not a reminder. A fine. A big one. 4 figures, printed clean and confident, labeled as a structural violation. The offense was my shed. I stood in the driveway staring at that shed like I had never seen it before. It was an old, solid structure set back behind the tree line, built long before I ever moved in, long before the street had neat sidewalks and matching street lamps. My uncle had used it to store lumber, tools, and spare hardware for repairs. It was not collapsing, not leaning, not dangerous. It was just not pretty in the way the HOA liked. It looked like a working man's shed, not a decorative accessory. The fine claimed the shed was an unapproved outbuilding. It also claimed it violated setback requirements and aesthetic guidelines. What made my jaw tighten was the date. They were treating it like it had been built recently. Like I had thrown it up overnight just to disrespect them. I did what reasonable people do first. I tried to resolve it politely. I called the number on the letter, left a calm voicemail, and asked for documentation showing I was under their authority. I wrote an email, attached photos of the original permits my uncle had kept, and asked them to confirm the exact rule they were citing. I even offered to meet at a reasonable time and show them the permit records in person. The response did not come by email. It came in my yard. I heard tires on gravel and looked up to see her car turning into my driveway like it had every right. She stepped out dressed like she was going to a luncheon, not a confrontation, and behind her was a young man holding a clipboard with a badge clipped to his shirt that looked fresh out of plastic packaging. He had the posture of someone pretending to be official, shoulders squared but eyes darting. She did not call first. She did not knock. She walked. Straight past my gate, straight onto my property. "What are you doing?" I said, stepping off my porch, keeping my voice controlled even though my pulse was climbing fast. The board leader did not slow down. She smiled without warmth and nodded toward the young man beside her. "Compliance inspection," she said, like she was announcing the weather. "We received reports. We have to verify conditions." "You do not have permission to be here," I said. "You need to leave." She turned toward me with the kind of expression people wear when they enjoy watching someone else get frustrated. "You live in a managed community," she said. "Your property is subject to inspection. That's how it works." The young man lifted his clipboard and tried to look stern. "Sir, if you interfere, it will be documented as obstruction. Obstruction. On my own land." I felt something hot flare behind my ribs. "My land," I said slowly, "is not managed by you. You do not get to walk through my yard because you want to." She tilted her head. "That shed is a problem," she said, pointing like a queen condemning a peasant's barn. "It's unsightly. It reduces property values. And I'm not going to argue about it." I held up the fine letter. "I already sent you the permits," I said. "That shed predates the HOA. I want documentation proving you have jurisdiction here, and I want this fine removed." Her smile sharpened. "Permits don't matter if the community standards have changed," she said. "And jurisdiction is not something you get to debate with us." The young man started snapping photos with his phone, moving closer to my shed, zooming in like he was collecting trophies. He circled my workshop as if it were a crime scene. "That's enough," I said, stepping between them and the building. The board leader's tone snapped from sweet to cold. "Move," she said, "or you'll be looking at additional penalties." I could see a curtain shifting across the street. Someone was watching. And that, more than anything, made me furious. She was doing this in public on purpose. She wanted an audience. She wanted the neighborhood to see me as the problem. A car door opened next door. Mrs. Lorraine Palmer, an older neighbor with silver hair and a face that had seen too much nonsense to be impressed by it, walked onto her porch holding a mug. She did not call out. She just watched with calm, steady eyes. I was grateful for the witness. "You need to leave," I said again, louder now. Instead, the board leader walked around me as if I were a fence post. She pointed at my workshop. "Commercial activity," she said, scribbling something on a paper. "Unlicensed. Improper use." "I fix things," I said. "I have tools. That does not make it commercial." She pointed at stacked firewood near the tree line. "Unsightly materials." Then she pointed at my old pickup parked beside the driveway. "Inoperable vehicle." "It runs," I snapped. "And improper land use," she added, as if she could simply label something and make it true. I could feel the young man behind her gaining confidence, like her arrogance was contagious. He stepped closer again. "Sir, this is all being documented. You'll receive formal notices. If you fail to comply, the board may pursue enforcement." Enforcement. Another word that sounded too big for what they were doing, but that was the point. Big words make people feel small. I took one breath and forced myself not to explode. Anger would be exactly what she wanted. Anger would make me look unstable. Anger would make her story easier to sell. So I asked the simplest question. "Show me the papers," I said. "Show me where I signed anything. Show me where my deed says you have authority over my land." She stepped closer until I could smell her perfume. "We don't need you to sign," she said softly, like a threat wrapped in velvet. "Membership follows the street." "It follows the development. And your property is in our footprint now. Now." As if she had decided it recently. Mrs. Caper. Palmer's mug lowered slightly. Her eyes narrowed. I saw it in her face. Even she knew that sounded wrong. "Get off my property," I said, voice steady, hands clenched to my sides. "Right now." For a moment, I thought she might actually listen. Her gaze flickered to Mrs. Palmer watching, then back to me. Then she smiled again, wider, meaner. "We'll be back," she said. "And if you want to make it hard, we can make it hard." She turned and walked away like she was bored, like she had not just trespassed and threatened me on my own driveway. The young man followed, still taking photos until I stared him down hard enough that his hand dropped. They left, but they did not stop. That evening, I found another envelope in my mailbox, then another the next morning. Then two more the day after that. Notices stacked like a countdown. Violations I had never heard of. Rules I had never agreed to. Fees that climbed with every paper, as if the numbers were made up on the spot. By the end of the week, my mailbox was stuffed so full I had to pull the stack out with both hands. The top notice had a deadline printed in bold. Comply within 72 hours, or the board will begin lien proceedings. I carried the papers inside, spread them across my kitchen table, and stared at them until my eyes burned. I could hear laughter outside, kids still riding their bikes, the neighborhood pretending everything was normal. But my calm was gone. My peace was gone. Late that night, I pulled out my uncle's boxes and started digging. Deeds, surveys, old closing documents. I opened my laptop and searched county records until the screen blurred. Because somewhere in those files was the truth, and I knew one thing for certain now. She was not confused. She was coming for my land. The letters did not slow down after that week. They multiplied. It felt like someone had discovered a machine that printed anxiety and decided to let it run without stopping. Every time I opened the mailbox, another envelope waited. Some were thin warnings. Others were thick packets filled with forms, citations, and bold type that used words like enforcement, non-compliance, and final notice. The language was always polite on the surface, but the message underneath was the same. You are being watched. You are being measured. You are losing ground. Then the city notices started. A white truck with the municipal logo rolled onto my street one afternoon while I was tightening a hinge on the shed door. A man in a reflective vest stepped out holding a clipboard, looking uncomfortable before he even spoke. He explained that anonymous complaints had been filed regarding zoning concerns, safety hazards, and unregistered construction. Anonymous. The word hung in the air like smoke. He walked the perimeter, took a few photos, and admitted quietly that nothing looked dangerous. But the report still had to be filed. Procedure, he said, just procedure. Procedure was becoming a weapon. After that, the drive-bys increased. Her car would appear at the corner at odd hours, engine idling, phone held up just long enough for me to notice. Sometimes it was slow and deliberate, like a patrol. Other times it was quick, a flash of tinted windows and taillights. The message was clear even when no paper arrived. I was not alone. I was under a lens. The emails came next. Not to me. To the neighborhood. I only saw them because Mrs. Ambias. Palmer printed one and slipped it under my door with a note that said, "Thought you should know." The subject line read, "Community Standards Reminder," but my address was highlighted in bold within the body. Aerial photographs were attached, red circles drawn around my shed, my workshop, even my parked truck. Words like blight and risk appeared beside them. It was a public trial without my presence, a quiet smear campaign disguised as administrative concern. I attended the next HOA meeting because I still believed reason might work. I ironed a shirt, gathered my permits, and walked into the community center with a folder tucked under my arm. The room smelled like coffee and dry carpet. Folding chairs were arranged in neat rows. Conversations hushed when I entered. I could feel eyes tracking me, measuring me the way the letters had. When the board leader called the meeting to order, she smiled the same rehearsed smile and dimmed the lights. A projector flickered to life behind her. My property filled the wall in high resolution. The shed. The workshop. The truck. Red circles. Red arrows. Red labels. It felt like watching my home become evidence in a case I did not agree to join. She spoke calmly, presenting my life as a list of infractions, each sentence followed by a nod from someone in the front row. I raised my hand, asked to respond, offered documentation. She thanked me and moved on as if I were a commercial break she could skip. After the meeting, I walked outside and dialed the non-emergency police line. I explained the trespassing, the harassment, the threats. The officer who arrived listened politely, hands resting on his belt, eyes scanning the quiet street. He said the same phrase I would hear more than once after that. Civil matter. He suggested I consult a lawyer, maybe file a complaint if things escalated further. Escalated further. I almost laughed. The sky was already dark with it. Sleep stopped being restful. I woke at small sounds. Headlights through the curtains made my chest tighten. I started checking the locks twice, then 3 times. My phone stayed on the nightstand with the camera app open more often than not. Conversations with my sister grew tense because she worried, and I dismissed it, not wanting to admit how much the pressure was getting to me. The house felt smaller, even though the land around it was wide open. One evening, the intimidation reached past paper and into flesh. My sister had come by with groceries, trying to lighten the mood with small talk and a bag of oranges she insisted were the sweetest in town. She was halfway through the gate when the board leader's SUV rolled up and stopped so abruptly that gravel spat against the curb. The window slid down. The smile was gone. The tone was sharp. She told my sister that visitors were contributing to congestion and that repeated violations would be documented. My sister stood frozen, holding the grocery bag like it might shield her. I stepped forward and told her to leave. She did, but not before delivering one last sentence about consequences. My sister's hand shook all the way into the kitchen. The next week brought the vote. Another email circulated, this one marked urgent. A neighborhood decision would be held to classify my property as non-compliant. The wording made it sound democratic, like a community garden choosing flower colors, but the effect was the same as a verdict. I attended again, folder thicker now, patience thinner. The room buzzed with quiet opinions. Some neighbors avoided my eyes. Others offered brief nods of support that disappeared as soon as the board leader looked their way. When the motion was read, it felt rehearsed. I spoke, presented dates, permits, logic. She countered with phrases like collective standards and shared responsibility. The vote passed by a margin that felt less like consensus and more like fatigue. I walked home under streetlights that hummed faintly overhead. The creek behind the houses gurgled like it always had, indifferent to the politics on its banks. I told myself I would not surrender. The word surrender tasted bitter anyway. This was not a battlefield. It was my home. But the pressure had weight now. It pressed against my ribs when I breathed. The breaking point arrived folded in heavy paper with a gold seal. A legal notice. Formal language. Deadlines. The phrase intent to initiate foreclosure proceedings sat in the center like a stone. It was not immediate. It was not final. But it was close enough to feel real. I stood at the kitchen counter reading it again and again until the words blurred into shapes. Outside, a dog barked. A car door slammed somewhere down the street. Life continued as if nothing had shifted, but everything had. That night, I spread every document across the table and realized the situation had moved beyond annoyance, beyond irritation, beyond neighborhood politics. This was pressure applied with precision. This was a campaign. And if I did not push back with something stronger than frustration, the next envelope would not be a warning. It would be a loss. The notice with the gold seal did not scare me the way it was supposed to. It angered me. Not the loud, explosive kind of anger that burns out fast, but the quiet kind that sharpens your focus until everything else fades. I set it on the kitchen table, poured a glass of water I never drank, and opened the first of the storage boxes my uncle had left behind. If they were going to bury me in paper, I was going to dig my way out with the same weapon. The boxes smelled faintly of dust and old ink. Every folder was labeled in his careful handwriting: surveys, permits, receipts, closing documents, property lines drawn in blue and black, rolled tight with rubber bands that had dried and cracked with age. He had kept everything. At the time I inherited it, I thought it was excessive. That night, it felt like foresight bordering on genius. I spread the documents across the table until the wood disappeared beneath a patchwork of decades. Deeds from years before the street even had a name. Survey maps with precise measurements. Letters from county offices stamped and signed. I worked slowly, comparing dates, tracing boundaries with my finger, letting the patterns reveal themselves. The clock on the wall ticked louder as the night deepened. Outside, the streetlights flickered on and off with their usual hum, but inside the house everything narrowed to paper and ink. The discovery did not arrive with fanfare. It was a single paragraph buried halfway through an old closing packet, almost overlooked because the page looked like boilerplate. But the language was different. It was specific. It stated that the property, by virtue of its original filing and independent access easement, was permanently excluded from future association governance unless explicitly reconveyed by the owner. Permanently excluded. The words felt unreal for a moment, like I was misreading them out of desperation. I read it again, then again. Each time the meaning settled deeper. I checked the signature at the bottom. My uncle's name, the county seal. A date that predated the HOA by years. This was not a loophole. It was a wall, a legal boundary as solid as concrete. My first reaction was disbelief. My second was relief so sharp it almost hurt. Then came determination, rising steady and unshakable. They had been waving authority like a flag, but this document proved the flag was planted on land that was never theirs. I scanned the page, printed copies, highlighted the clause in yellow. Then I kept digging. And as I dug, another pattern began to emerge, not about my property, but about theirs, filing dates that did not line up. Amendments submitted without corresponding signatures. A board election recorded twice with different outcomes. Small inconsistencies at first, then larger ones that made my eyebrows lift. I opened the county tax portal and searched the board leader's name. Late payments, penalties, extensions. The image she projected of flawless control started to fracture. The realization changed the way I sat in that chair. My shoulders straightened. My breathing slowed. I was no longer reacting to their moves. I was studying them. The same meticulous habits my uncle had practiced, the same attention to detail I had learned just by watching him organize a desk, suddenly felt like inherited skills rather than quirks. I knew how to read these documents. I knew how to follow a paper trail. Years of dealing with leases, contracts, and property transfers had quietly trained me for exactly this kind of moment. The next day, I knocked on Mrs. Astor Palmer's door. She listened as I explained what I had found, her eyes widening slightly as she read the highlighted clause. She told me about a retired surveyor who lived 2 streets over, a quiet man who spent his mornings tending a vegetable garden with the precision of someone who once measured land for a living. By afternoon, I was sitting at his kitchen table while he examined the copies through thick glasses. He nodded once, then twice, then leaned back and said the words I needed to hear. "This is binding," he said. They never had jurisdiction. Not then. Not now. Hearing it from someone else turned certainty into confidence. The paper was not just real. It was powerful. From that point forward, everything I did had a different energy. I installed a small camera by the gate, another near the shed. I began logging every drive-by, every email, every notice with timestamps and screenshots. Conversations were written down immediately after they happened. I printed their public filings and highlighted the inconsistencies. I was not collecting memories anymore. I was building a case. At night, when the house was quiet and the creek murmured behind the trees, I practiced how I would present it. Not angrily. Not defensively. Calm. Precise. Let the documents speak. Let the dates line up like dominoes. Let the truth be simple enough that anyone in the room could understand it. The fear that had been sitting in my chest for weeks began to dissolve, replaced by something steadier. Resolve. They had tried to isolate me with letters and public shame, but paper had 2 sides. If they wanted this fight to live in documents, I was ready to meet them there. One evening, I placed the exclusion clause at the top of a new folder and slid it closed with deliberate care. The plan had formed fully now. The next meeting they scheduled, the next public accusation, the next attempt to label my home as theirs, that would be the moment. I would not argue. I would not raise my voice. I would simply open the folder and let the weight of their own system fall back on them. For the first time since the pounding on my gate before sunrise, I slept without checking the locks twice, because I was no longer waiting to defend myself. I was preparing to end it. Once the clause was in my hands and its meaning confirmed, I stopped reacting and started arranging. Every move I made after that was quiet on purpose. No announcements. No threats. Just preparation. I ordered 2 small security cameras online that looked like ordinary porch lights and installed them myself one evening just before sunset. One faced the gate. The other watched the side yard near the shed. I tested the angles 3 times, adjusted them until the coverage was clean, then left them alone. From the street, nothing had changed. From my phone, everything had. The first real proof arrived sooner than I expected. 3 nights after installation, a notification buzzed across my screen just past midnight. I opened the feed and watched the board leader's silhouette step through the gate with a flashlight in her hand. She did not knock. She did not hesitate. She moved with the confidence of someone who believed no one would question her. The timestamp glowed in the corner like a witness that could not be intimidated. I saved the clip in 3 separate locations before I even stood up from the couch. It was a small victory, but it felt enormous. For the first time, the pressure shifted an inch in my favor. The next morning, I began reaching out quietly to neighbors who had whispered advice weeks earlier. I did not ask for confrontation. I asked for truth. A retired couple 2 houses down admitted they had received similar notices about their fence height and had paid the fines just to avoid stress. A young father showed me emails where the board threatened towing over a temporary trailer he had parked during renovations. Each conversation added another thread to the same pattern. Some neighbors were afraid to speak publicly, but many were willing to write brief statements. I did not push. I let them choose their comfort level. The stack of printed testimonies grew slowly but steadily, each page a reminder that I was not the only target. At the county records office, I requested certified copies of my deed and the original survey maps. The clerk stamped each page with deliberate care, the sound of the seal pressing into paper echoing louder than it should have. I slid the copies into protective sleeves and arranged them in chronological order. Dates lined up. Signatures matched. Boundaries were clear. The folder was no longer just a defense. It was a timeline of facts that did not bend. The board leader did not slow down during this time. If anything, her tactics sharpened. Emails became more frequent, each one carrying a slightly stronger tone. Notices referenced escalating penalties and referenced sections of bylaws that still did not apply to me. She drove by more often, sometimes twice in a single afternoon. But now, every pass was recorded, every message archived. What once felt like harassment was becoming documentation. One evening, another small win arrived, disguised as routine correspondence. An HOA email intended for multiple recipients accidentally included internal comments in the thread. In those comments, board members debated whether my property technically fell under their jurisdiction. The phrasing was cautious, uncertain, and it contradicted every confident statement they had made publicly. I printed the email immediately, highlighted the lines, and slid it into the folder. Their own words were now evidence. Support started appearing in quieter ways, too. A neighbor left a handwritten note in my mailbox thanking me for standing up. Another waved from across the street and mouthed the words, "Good luck, Mrs. Bask." Palmer brought over a plate of cookies with a smile that said more than the words she chose. None of it was loud, but it was steady. The isolation I had felt weeks earlier began to dissolve, replaced by a sense that the neighborhood was watching the same story unfold and slowly recognizing its shape. Then the announcement came. An emergency HOA meeting scheduled for the following Thursday. Agenda, final compliance review, and penalty confirmation. The phrasing was formal, but the intention was clear. They believed they were closing the case. I read the notice twice, then once more, and felt the timing click into place. This was the stage. This was the room where the documents would speak. From that day forward, my preparation became precise. I organized the folder into sections: deeds, surveys, exclusion clause, camera footage, testimonies, internal emails. I created duplicates. I labeled tabs so I could find each piece in seconds. I rehearsed the order of presentation until it felt natural. I contacted the retired surveyor again and asked if he would attend, not to argue, just to confirm technical details if needed. He agreed with a simple nod. Backup was no longer an idea, it was present. The tension shifted into something quieter but sharper. She continued her campaign, unaware that every move added weight to the case she was helping me build. I continued mine, careful not to reveal confidence. We were circling the same moment from opposite sides, both believing we were setting the trap. 2 days before the meeting, another notification appeared on my phone. She stood at the gate again, reading something from her clipboard, unaware of the lens above her. I saved the clip beside the others and closed the app with a calm I had not felt in weeks. The evidence was complete. The timeline was clear. The room was scheduled. When the final reminder email for the meeting arrived, its tone triumphant and absolute, I smiled for the first time since this began. She believed she had arranged a public confirmation of her authority. What she had actually scheduled was a forum for its collapse. The community center parking lot was already half full when I arrived. The sun was dipping low enough to stretch long shadows across the pavement, turning every parked car into a dark silhouette. I sat behind the wheel for a moment longer than necessary, watching people drift toward the entrance in small clusters. Some walked quickly, avoiding eye contact. Others lingered near their trunks, whispering to each other like they were about to witness something they were not sure they wanted to see. My folder rested on the passenger seat, edges perfectly aligned, tabs visible like quiet signals of order. I touched it once, not to check its weight, but to steady my own breathing. Inside, the room felt smaller than it had during the last meeting. Folding chairs were arranged in tighter rows, the air warmer, heavier. Conversations hushed as I entered, not completely silent, but softened enough to make their presence obvious. I nodded to Mrs. Broke, Palmer near the back. She gave a small smile and a reassuring tilt of her head. 2 rows ahead, the retired surveyor sat with his hands folded calmly, as if he were waiting for a routine appointment rather than a confrontation that had consumed weeks of tension. At the front of the room, the board leader stood beside a long table draped in a navy cloth. Board members flanked her on both sides, their papers stacked neatly, their expressions rehearsed. 2 security guards stood near the exit doors, arms crossed, eyes scanning the crowd with the bored vigilance of people hired to look serious. She looked composed, confident, almost relaxed. When she saw me enter, her lips curved into a smile that did not reach her eyes. It was the smile of someone who believed the outcome had already been decided. I took a seat near the aisle, placed the folder on my lap, and opened it just enough to confirm the order of the documents. Survey. Exclusion clause. Emails. Testimonies. Camera stills. Everything where it should be. My fingers felt steady, but my chest carried a low hum of nerves that would not fully quiet. Resolve and anxiety moved through me at the same time, colliding and then settling into something sharper than either alone. The meeting opened with routine formalities. Minutes approved. Attendance noted. Then her tone shifted. She stepped forward, voice amplified by the small microphone clipped to her collar, and began outlining the agenda. Compliance review. Final penalties. Community standards. Each phrase was delivered with practiced clarity, each pause measured. When she reached my address, she lifted a printed sheet as if it were an exhibit. The projector flickered on behind her, and once again my property filled the wall. The same aerial angles. The same red circles. Only this time the annotations were bolder, the language firmer, non-compliant. Repeated violations. Pending action. Murmurs rippled through the chairs. I could feel the attention settle on me like a weight. I kept my eyes on the folder, turning one page slowly, letting the rhythm anchor me. She listed citations in a steady stream, each one presented as fact rather than accusation. When she finished, she looked directly at me and asked if I wished to respond. The room leaned forward without moving. I stood. My voice, when it came, surprised me with its calm. I asked for clarification on jurisdiction. I mentioned documentation. I did not raise my tone. I did not accuse. I simply asked questions that forced her to speak longer, to explain more, to commit her position publicly. She answered with confidence, repeating the same claims she had made in letters and emails. The board members nodded in agreement. The security guards shifted their stance slightly, sensing the tension without understanding its shape. As the exchange continued, I felt the room change, not dramatically. Subtly. The neighbors who had once looked uncertain now watched with sharper focus. A man in the 3rd row crossed his arms and frowned. A woman near the back leaned forward, whispering to the person beside her. The board leader's voice grew firmer, louder, her phrases more absolute. She referenced bylaws and community authority, each word another brick laid into a wall she believed was unbreakable. Votes were mentioned, legal actions referenced, deadlines repeated. The language escalated, not in volume but in severity. It was a performance of certainty, and she delivered it flawlessly. I let her continue. Every sentence she spoke was another thread tying her position tighter, another public commitment that would not unravel easily once the truth was shown. I could feel my pulse in my fingertips now, steady but strong, like a drumbeat counting down. When she finished, the room hung in a quiet that felt stretched thin. Papers rustled. Chairs creaked. Someone coughed near the door. She looked at me again, expecting frustration, perhaps even surrender. Instead, I closed the folder gently and rose from my seat. The motion was small, but it drew every eye in the room. I walked to the front slowly, each step measured, the sealed folder held against my chest. The projector light cast a pale glow across the table as I reached it. I could see the reflection of the red circles on the polished surface, the same symbols that had been used to frame my home as a problem. My hand moved to the clasp. The room seemed to narrow to the space between my fingers and the metal latch. I looked up once more, meeting her confident gaze, and then I opened the folder. The latch clicked open louder than it should have. Or maybe the room had simply gone so quiet that even a small sound carried weight. I turned the folder toward the projector and placed the first document beneath the camera. The image on the wall changed from red circles and accusations to clean black lines and official seals, a certified deed. My name, the original filing date. The county stamp pressed deep enough to cast a faint shadow. I'm not here to argue, I said, keeping my voice even. I'm here to clarify. I slid the next page forward. The original survey map filled the screen, boundary lines drawn with precise measurements, the creek marked, the easement labeled. The retired surveyor in the third row leaned forward, nodding slightly as if confirming each number without needing to speak. The board leader's smile tightened, just a fraction, the first crack in the surface she had held so carefully. Then I placed the clause under the lens. The paragraph appeared in bold relief on the wall, highlighted in yellow. The language was direct, unmistakable. Permanent exclusion from future association governance unless explicitly reconveyed by the owner. The county seal beneath it shimmered under the projector light. I did not rush the moment. I let the words sit there, large enough for everyone in the room to read for themselves. Murmurs began at the back and moved forward like a ripple across water. Someone whispered, "What does that mean?" Another voice answered quietly, "It means they can't control it." The board members shifted in their seats. Papers that had been stacked neatly minutes earlier were suddenly being shuffled without purpose. "That document is outdated," the board leader said quickly. "Community bylaws supersede." "They do not supersede recorded property exclusions," the retired surveyor said from his seat, his tone calm but firm. "That clause is binding unless the owner signs it away." Her eyes flicked toward him, then back to the wall. The projector's glow made the yellow highlight almost luminous, impossible to ignore. I moved to the next section of the folder and placed printed emails under the camera. Internal board messages, lines highlighted where they questioned jurisdiction, where uncertainty replaced certainty. Her earlier confidence began to dissolve, replaced by the tightness of someone realizing their footing was no longer solid. "I also want to show something else," I said. I tapped my phone and the screen behind me changed again. Grainy night footage appeared. The gate, the timestamp glowing in the corner, her silhouette stepping inside without knocking. A soft intake of breath swept the room. I let the clip run only a few seconds before pausing it on a clear frame. The security guards near the door shifted uncomfortably. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, searching for a denial that would not contradict what everyone had just seen. "That could be anyone," she said, but the conviction was gone. I slid witness statements under the camera next. Short, simple paragraphs signed by neighbors. Trespassing observed. Intimidation described. Fines disputed. Each page added weight, not through volume, but through consistency. The narrative she had built began to crumble under the collective evidence. The red circles that once framed my property as a problem were replaced by documents framing her authority as an illusion. The room's energy shifted fully now. Doubt turned into shock. Shock into something closer to anger. Not at me, but at the realization that the rules they had trusted were being misused. A man in the front row stood and asked a question about his own fines. A woman near the back held up her phone, recording openly. The board members stopped nodding and started looking at each other instead. A voice near the entrance cut through the noise. A local legal advisor who often attended community meetings stepped forward, requesting a pause. He reviewed the projected clause for less than a minute, then spoke in a tone that carried authority without raising volume. Proceedings should halt until jurisdiction was verified. The phrase landed like a gavel. The board leader's shoulders lowered, not in relief but in resignation. I closed the folder gently and stepped back. I did not need to raise my voice. The documents had done the speaking. Applause began in the back, hesitant at first, then spreading row by row until it filled the room. It was not thunderous. It was steady. The sound of neighbors acknowledging that something important had just been corrected. The board leader tried once more to reclaim control, referencing procedural reviews and future discussions, but the words felt hollow now. The authority she had projected for weeks had been dismantled piece by piece, not with anger, but with ink and dates and seals that could not be argued away. One of the board members quietly gathered their papers and stepped aside. Another avoided eye contact entirely. The security guards relaxed their stance, their presence suddenly unnecessary. I felt the tension leave my shoulders in a slow exhale. Not triumph exactly. Something calmer. Dignity returning to its proper place. My home was no longer an exhibit on a screen or a list of violations in a letter. It was what it had always been, mine, protected by lines drawn long before this conflict ever started. As the meeting dissolved into conversations and questions, the projector light dimmed and the red circles vanished from the wall. In their place lingered only the memory of official seals and highlighted words that had shifted the balance completely. The false authority that had loomed over my gate before sunrise weeks ago was gone, exposed under its own paperwork, and as I gathered the folder and turned toward the exit, I knew the battle in that room was finished. But the full aftermath, the formal consequences, and the rebuilding of trust in the neighborhood were only just beginning. The weeks after the meeting felt strangely quiet, like the air after a long storm when the wind finally drops, and you realize how loud it had been the whole time. The legal review moved faster than anyone expected. Certified copies of the exclusion clause were filed formally with the county again, stamped and cross-referenced so there would be no room for future confusion. The board leader stepped down within days, first citing personal reasons, then disappearing from community emails altogether. 2 other board members resigned soon after, their signatures appearing at the bottom of brief notices that sounded more like apologies than announcements. A temporary committee formed, made up of neighbors who had rarely spoken during the conflict, but now volunteered openly. The tone of the HOA changed almost overnight. Emails became shorter, clearer, free of threats and heavy language. Meeting agendas were posted publicly. Votes were recorded and shared instead of summarized vaguely. The new leadership did something simple that had never been done before. They listened. People began attending meetings not out of fear, but curiosity. Conversations replaced whispers. Transparency replaced tension. I received a few quiet apologies. Mrs. Way. Palmer brought over a small potted plant one morning and set it by the gate with a smile that said more than the words she used. A couple down the street admitted they had voted against me out of worry rather than belief, and they thanked me for standing firm. None of it felt dramatic. None of it needed to. The shift in the neighborhood was visible in small gestures. Waves from across the street, casual conversations by the mailbox, children riding bikes without their parents glancing nervously at passing cars. My own life settled back into a rhythm I had almost forgotten. The cameras remained, but I checked them less and less. The folder that had once stayed on my kitchen table moved to a shelf, then into a drawer, still organized but no longer necessary as a daily shield. Mornings returned to being simple. Coffee on the porch. The sound of the creek behind the trees. Sunlight stretching across the driveway without the shadow of suspicion attached to it. The gate, once a symbol of intrusion and confrontation, became just a gate again, something you open and close without thinking. I was asked more than once to join the HOA board. I declined the formal position, but agreed to attend meetings occasionally as an advisor when property or documentation questions arose. It felt like the right balance. I did not want authority. I wanted balance. If my experience could prevent the same misuse of power from happening again, then it had value beyond my own driveway. But I also wanted my privacy back, the freedom to live without turning every envelope into a potential threat. The biggest change was not in paperwork or leadership. It was in the atmosphere. The neighborhood stopped feeling like a place where rules hovered over conversations and started feeling like a community again. People borrowed tools, shared advice about repairs, offered help instead of warnings. The fear that had once crept into daily routines faded quietly, replaced by something steadier, mutual respect. It was not perfect, but it was honest, and that honesty made all the difference. Looking back, the lesson was never just about one clause or one meeting. It was about knowing what protects you and being willing to stand behind it calmly. Documentation was not just paper. It was clarity. Courage was not loud confrontation. It was the refusal to be pushed into silence. And community was not defined by bylaws or committees. It was defined by the people who chose fairness when it mattered. Now, when I step outside in the morning and the air is cool and the gate swings open without resistance, the house feels like it did the first day I arrived, a place chosen for peace, finally allowed to be peaceful again. The street is quiet in the best way, not tense, not watchful, just alive with ordinary life. And for the first time in a long while, home truly feels like home again. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to Fenceline Files. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?